we are in an era where it seems that there is, and I don't want to overstate it, but there seems to be a resurgence in labor's sense of its power regarding withholding its labor. We saw over, I guess it was last summer, a series of teacher strikes. We've seen some this year. We've seen the power of the flight attendants union, which I think was not given as much credit as it deserved in ending the government shutdown. And you've written a piece that basically says that there's another way to build the labor movement. I think this week, I think it was, Bernie Sanders came out and talked about a federal law that would essentially attempt to nullify the concept of right to work in what is now, I think, about 27 states across the country. But you have written a piece that the way to rebuild the labor movement, one of the ways, is to do it state by state. And you use as a model for this the conservative anti-union advocacy that has been an ongoing project of the right for decades. Just give us the broad outlines of what that anti-union movement has been.
Sure thing. So as I talk about in the piece, I go back to the 1970s and I discuss the formation of conservative groups of activists, donors, and businesses, most notably the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, but also the State Policy Network and Americans for Prosperity in later years. And I talk about how those groups were formed out of this sense that conservatives were losing ground at the state level to unions, to public sector unions, which had just gotten the right to collectively bargain and participate in labor relations and in politics in a real way during those decades. And those organizations recognized that if they were going to make inroads in power in the United States, they're going to have to do it across the states, given the important role that states play in setting policy across the United States and shifting politics. And so that's exactly what they did. They went state by state and passed cutbacks to public sector labor union rights and private sector labor union rights through right-to-work laws, cuts to collective bargaining, and laws to make it more difficult for labor unions to participate in politics. And crucially, they never saw those cutbacks as an end in and of themselves. As I talk about in the piece, they saw it as part of a broader political strategy that would weaken Democrats and weaken the left. And as I've shown in other work, when states pass right-to-work laws, Democrats do worse at the polls, up and down the ballot, and it's harder for progressives to push left-leaning legislation. So that's the story I paint of how conservatives learn the importance of the states and learn the importance of pushing anti-labor legislation across the states. And I'm saying that progressives today should harness the energy that we're seeing through the teacher strikes, through private sector mobilizations, to pass laws at the state level and organize at the state level to rebuild labor rights. Ultimately, I think that's the only way that the labor movement and the left is going to restore the clout that conservatives have retrenched.
All right, and I want to get to some of the things that have taken place really in the past year and past couple of years that have really or could have and may have undercut the strength of unions, or at least undercut the pre-existing funding model that we had. And I want to get to that in a moment. But just in terms of that long game that the conservatives have played to undercut unions, which, as you say, also has a direct bearing on the power of the Democratic Party. And we should also add, the Democrats were also tacking away from unions during that period of time as well. Certainly, they weren't necessarily passing legislation that would undercut the power of unions, but they were being a little bit of fair weather friends, if you will. But I mean, that's a fair statement, yes?
I think that's exactly right. It's just so striking to look at how conservatives and Republicans versus Democrats have treated labor unions over the decades. While conservatives were hard at work pushing Republican lawmakers to vote for cutbacks to labor union rights, Democrats were generally on the sidelines. If you look at state-level control, Republicans, as soon as they gain trifecta control of a state government, they push for cuts to collective bargaining for public sector labor unions and right-to-work laws. But Democrats don't have a similar portfolio of policies that they push when they gain power across the states. There's no Democratic equivalent of, say, a right-to-work law. And that's similarly true at the national level. During the last period when Democrats controlled Congress and the White House under the Obama administration notably let labor reform sort of fall by the wayside. There wasn't a concerted push to rebuild that power at the federal level either.
There was certainly talk of card check, which would have made it much easier to unionize in shops, and that seemed to melt away as soon as the Democrats took power. So there has to be, and I want to get into sort of the strategy that you're advocating here, but we should also be aware that there has to be a willingness and a genuine interest on behalf of Democratic voters as expressed with their candidates to do this. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen. It's not just a question of strategy, it seems to me, or lack of policy options. To the extent that there's a lack of policy options, I think that ties back into the actual will of the Democratic Party. My sense is that's changing, with a different generation of Democrats. But a lot of the Democrats that we've had now, the baby boomers, they came up in an era where the power of unions was undercut even within the Democratic Party. I mean, it wasn't a particularly democratic apparatus, but we used to not have primaries. We used to just have some union leaders that more or less in a back room negotiating with a couple other Democratic Party leaders as to who's going to be the nominee.
Yeah, I think it's exactly right that Democrats took the labor movement for granted, that every 2-4 years when it was time for elections, they counted on unions to do the hard work of grassroots mobilization, to get people to the polls, to support the sort of candidates that were put up on the Democratic ticket. But in between those elections, they didn't do much to shore up the strength of labor unions, let alone giving labor unions the opportunity to expand. But I think you're right that the center of gravity is changing, and I think it's notable that the legislation you mentioned that was introduced in the Senate to ban right-to-work laws at the state level, that was supported by, I think, virtually all of the candidates running in the 2020 Democratic primary who are in the Senate.
All right. Well, look, let's take a break here. And when we come back, I want to start going through the process, really essentially the strategy that you outline in this piece on how to rebuild the labor movement state by state. And we're going to go through, too, if there is any type of a sense of which states we start at. I'm curious if the conservatives, as they attacked the labor movement, if they had a strategy about where they would start and where they would end. All right, we're going to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking to Alex Hertel-Fernandez. He's written a piece in the American Prospect, How to Rebuild the Labor Movement State by State, What Progressives Can Learn from Conservative Anti-Union Advocacy. We'll be right back.